Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have you with us. Today is the 5th event in the Center for European Studies TransAtlantic Master's Programs Friday Lecture Series. I'm Katie Shanahan-Lindner. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for European Studies and the Jean Monnet Center here at the UNC Chapel Hill. Today's exciting lecture is happening under the auspices of our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Thank you to the EU for your continued support of our programming. And is also part of the new Jean Monnet in the US lecture series. I'd like to recognize all of our amazing EU partners across the US, and especially thank our co-sponsors for today's event, the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as the University of Florida Center for European Studies. I'd also like to take a second to recognize that today is the 19th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, which changed our lives and world dramatically. Our thoughts go out to all of those families that were affected and are still affected every day. One small housekeeping item, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box, and be sure to identify yourself and your affiliation so we can recognize you when your question comes up. We are planning to go for about an hour total, maybe a little bit more. So I will try to get to as many questions as possible, but so get your questions in early. Okay, it is my absolute great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Cecilia Malmström is coming to us from Sweden, that lovely background you've got today. She is currently the Assar Gabrielsson Professor at the School of Business, Economics and Law at the University of Gothenburg, also the town in which she grew up. She served as European Commissioner for Trade from 2014 to 2019 and sealed trade agreements with, for example, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, Mexico, and the Mercosur bloc. There are surely others that you had your hand in. She served as European Commissioner for Home Affairs from 2010 to 2014, where she worked on projects tackling terrorism and online child sexual abuse, for example. From 2006 to 2010, she served as Minister for EU Affairs in the Swedish government. She had a large portfolio, which included things like the Baltic Sea Strategy, the Lisbon Strategy, and coordinating the Swedish presidency of the Council of the EU in 2009. She was a member of the European Parliament from 1999 to 2006, and worked there also, which I think is really important also for today, to increase transparency of information to citizens. This is really something that's very important for all of us. And she also worked on EU's Russia strategy, for example, something that we might also want to talk about today. Dr. Malmström has researched, taught, and written on issues in the fields of European politics, regionalism, immigration, and terrorism. In 2019, she was appointed the International Swede of the Year. Love that. And just most recently was nominated by the Prime Minister of Sweden to be Sweden's candidate for the position of Secretary General of the OECD. So Dr. Malmström, as you can see, these are just very small examples out of your very impressive and long CV. You've worked tirelessly fighting for Swedes and Europeans throughout your career. We're all looking very much forward to your talk today, entitled What's Next? Europe, Recovery, and the World. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. Also, I want to start with giving, by remembering the day that is today, the 11th of September, that really changed your life and the world as a whole. And I know that there are still victims and families and others who are suffering from this. So it's a special day. I saw there were commemorations going on as well in different parts of the US. We'll come back to the EU-US relation, of course, but I wanted to start a little bit by describing where we are in the EU right now, what might come next, and how we can possibly see a post-COVID scenario emerging. I would like to say that 2020, in January, there was still a time not very long ago where people had not heard about Corona or COVID-19, when there was a lot of optimism in the European Union, at least. There were a new leadership. There was, for the first time ever, a woman as the president of the European Commission, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen. There was a new president of the European Council, the Belgian former Prime Minister Charles Michel. There was a new High Representative, Spanish, Josep Borrell, and there was a newly elected European Parliament, had been elected already in May in 2019, and impatiently waiting for a new commission to be in office so that they could start work. Because of course, the last 6 months when I was still commissioner is a little bit of a caretaking situation. And there were 60% of the members of the European Parliament who were newly elected for the first time. So, and this is quite unique. So they were eagerly waiting to start working and had lots of expectations and of course wanting to deliver for their citizens, those who had elected them. The Commission started very early to produce a lot of kind of visionary documents on the priorities of the new Commission, on the digital agenda, on artificial intelligence, on a new industrial strategy, on the Green Deal, making sure that Europe would still be the leading power in the world when it comes to fighting climate change and fulfilling the Paris Agreement. The Commission was also preparing to launch in May last year, May this year, a big international European conference to discuss the future of Europe. It was supposed to be launched on Schuman Day, 70 years after the Schuman Declaration, and be a broad discussion on the future of Europe. What should Europe do? How should it do it? Involving citizens, local councils, national parliaments, business, NGOs, anybody. So that was the preparations. And then, of course, came Corona, and it changed everything dramatically. And I have to say that the first weeks of this crisis, starting end of February, beginning of March, was not a beautiful moment in Europe's history. It was like 70 years of integration suddenly just were forgotten. Every country went on their own. We saw closing of borders, we saw export restrictions within the internal market, which is something we never seen before. We saw that some countries even confiscated medical equipment and made a lot of national decisions without any coordination. It was quite chaotic. This can this is of course very sad. To a certain extent, it's understandable because the virus hit with such a magnitude, especially in some countries, especially Italy, and there was a pressure on the politicians to act, to do something quickly. People were dying. And the European Union has formally, legally, no judicial competence in health matters. This is a national responsibility, as you might know. So this created a chaos, and some countries, especially Italy, felt very isolated. They were the ones who were hit first and massively in certain parts of northern Italy. So this lack of European solidarity and this internal chaos, I would say, was of course something that a country like China took advantage on. You could maybe remember that you saw mask diplomacy, Chinese airplanes flying in medical equipment to a very large extent with flags and pomps and circumstances and photo ops and so on, taking advantage of the internal divisions within the European Union. And this gave a global picture, and also to the citizens of Europe as well, that Europe is divided and incapable of dealing with this. But after some weeks, I would say this changed. And researchers will show whether the Commission maybe stretched a little bit the legal limits of the Lisbon Treaty when it started to really take charge and say that this is not something any country can solve on its own. We have to cooperate. So the Commission started to coordinate the borders so that commodities, food, etc. could flow, so there wouldn't be any lack of goods. They started to help stocking some material, medical equipment. They started to distribute to some countries who were lacking. They started to coordinate doctors and other staff between the countries to help out each other. They coordinated some repatriation of almost 500,000 European citizens who were stranded abroad to come home, and they started to make common decision on a variety of issues, also mobilizing very quickly some emergency economic help for in order to deal with the most acute situation of unemployment and people being stuck. Because of course, as in the US, I mean, shops closed, people stopped traveling, restaurants closed, companies went bankrupt very quickly in many cases, and there was a quite draconic lockdown in some countries as well. Of course, countries could not have the exact same strategy because they were hit in different ways, but at least there were more coordination and reporting to Brussels. And the Commission also took the initiative for this recovery fund, as you know, proposing a very large sum, even if it will not be enough, where the EU as a whole would take loans to give, to grant, or to loan to the member states. This was subject to very, very difficult negotiations in the European Council. The prime ministers met for 5 days. There were lots of internal divisions. This was difficult, and under normal circumstances, it would not have been a possibility to agree on this. The thought that the EU would take this enormous debt, 750 million euros in loans and grants, is something that has been discussed in different form, Eurobonds and so on, in the past, but it would have not been possible to agree under other circumstances. But these are not normal circumstances. And in the end, after tough discussions, some compromises, some horse trading, as always in the European Council, there was an agreement. And I think that proved finally that the European Union realized that we must get out of this together, we must help each other, we must show solidarity, both because of solidarity reason, but also pure egoism. If the internal market collapses, this will affect every country dramatically. So we need to help those countries who are most hit. And at that long conference also there was an agreement on a long-term budget of the EU that had been negotiated for several years before. So that is now on the table, subject to the approval of the European Parliament. So there might be some minor changes there, but hopefully this will soon come into effect. And some countries have already started to publish the plans how to use their part of the recovery fund. This is, of course, a very good thing that the money is there. It will not be enough, but at least now we have to make sure that the process goes as smooth as possible and that the money is invested in long-term, sustainable investments, innovation, digitalization, that they just don't put money in old black holes, but that it's future oriented. And this is a joint interest for all member states, of course, and it will be carefully watched also by the Commission and the European Parliament. So this is so far so good, but we don't know what's going to happen now. There are several countries who might be in a stage of a second pandemic wave, where the virus is coming back quite heavily, and how that will affect human lives, health, and the economy still remains to be seen. And for the rest, we have also seen not only the European Union, who failed to, at least initially, cooperate as they should. Most international organizations actually have been very weak during this crisis. WTO, G7, G20, United Nations, everything has been weakened, and this is something we really need to look at how to repair. And meanwhile, the world is not standing still. Everybody's trying to cope with the pandemic, to get a vaccine. I know this debate is very heated in the US as well, and we need to prepare for possibly second or third waves. But in the meantime, we have other issues. In Europe, we have dramatic issues in our neighborhood. We have a growing conflict between Turkey and Greece. We have the demonstrations of the brave people in Belarus. We have a very tense situation with Russia after the poisoning of Mr. Navalny. We have tensions, as I said, with Turkey, and we have a world where our traditional allies are not as close as they used to be. An increasingly aggressive China, a US that is a traditional ally, but where the transatlantic relationship is very tense for the moment. And then just 2 days ago, we had a terrible accident in one of the Greek islands where a refugee camp has burned down, and that has left 13,000 migrants, refugees, without roof and without food. And this is just an illustration of the failure of the European Union to address the migration issue. So all this is knocking on the door and has to be dealt with. So what do we do? Well, as I said, we need to continue cooperating to make sure that even if some countries experience a new wave, that we coordinate, that we cooperate, that we don't just close borders without alerting each other, that we try to invest jointly in vaccine, that we distribute the recovery fund and the long-term budget in a wise way, that we do reforms that has been needed for a long time in the European Union, related, for instance, to the internal market, where most of the jobs are in the service sector, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape still remaining there. And EU countries have talked for ages about doing something, but now could be the time to really invest in a more future-oriented reform program here. We need to make sure that the Green Deal that was proposed just before the pandemic is not forgotten and put into a cupboard and say we'll deal with that on a sunny day. That has to be the center of the recovery. We need to make sure that the investments are sustainable, that they are climate friendly, that we use renewables, that we use the green technology that is there, and that we share that with each other, and that Europe continues to be a global leader and to ally with others as well. Migration has been one of the main problems for the European Union to find a solution. I dealt with that for 5 years. After that, it became even worse. I don't think it's my fault, but still it was difficult for member states to agree. The commissioner responsible for this will present end of the month a new proposal on how to have a joint strategy in the EU. I don't envy her, because this is a very difficult task, because some countries have and are still just refusing to cooperate to share the responsibility of the migrants coming to the EU, and there will be more as well. So this is not an issue that will disappear. But this is a crisis where we really need to find a common European solution. We need to address the issue of European values. We have seen during the pandemic that around 100 countries of the world have taken measures that are not so democratic in a way to urgently fight the pandemic. And this could be okay if there are checks and balances and if they are very temporary and limited, and most of them have now gone back to normal. But in some countries, this way to circumvent parliament, control, shut down media and so on are still there. And we see it, it didn't happen during the pandemic, but it got worse during the pandemic, especially in Hungary and in Poland, where there has been for several years problems related to the freedom of media, of the rule of law system, discrimination issues, the independence of the judicial system. And this is something where the Commission has been in very intense dialogue with the two countries for a long time. Some of the proposals have gone to the European Court. Some have been won from the Commission side in the court, but some are still there. And prestigious international research in organizations such as Human Rights Watch, but also many other researchers say that Hungary is not any longer a democracy. And Poland is on its way away from being a democracy. And this is very, very serious, because at the heart of the European Union, we have two countries who are not full democracies anymore. And we see tendencies in other countries as well. And this must be addressed, because it's a commitment. If you join the European Union, you don't always it's not only about fulfilling the economic criteria, it's also about respecting certain core values. And if there is systematic breach of those values year after year, that has to have consequences. And in the agreement, those long 5 days and nights, there was an agreement that the Commission would come up with a proposal that you might be, there might be a punishment to certain countries if they break those rules, meaning that they will not have access to joint financing in the same way. This has been discussed for ages, but now the Commission has promised that they will put such a proposal on the table this fall, and it is not only a demand from a majority of the member states and many citizens, but also the European Parliament has said that this is condition for us to accept the budget. So I know that smart brains are working on this in the Commission, but of course it would be very difficult to put it into law in practice as well. But this is also about the credibility. The European Union flatters itself, rightly so, to be a center of values and democracy and human rights, and want to engage with the world on these terms. But how can you be credible if you, within your own family, have these severe problems of human rights violation, of the lack of independence of the judicial system, or as in Poland, some municipalities have declared themselves LGTB-free zones. This is what's happening in Europe in 2020. This is totally unacceptable, of course. So it has to be addressed. So this is on the to-do list that needs to be done. Another issue that I'm sure you've heard about, many of you are maybe concerned via family or other relations, is something we call Brexit. It's a negotiation we have with our friends in the UK who have left the European Union and who are, until the end of the year, still part of the internal market. It was supposed to be a transition period where we would negotiate a way of handling our future relation, both when it comes to trade, very important, but also other issues such as fisheries, all kinds of cooperation to fight terrorism, to do research, military and foreign policy cooperation, a lot of issues. Those negotiations are stuck, totally, and the clock is ticking. There was just a negotiation round ending today, this morning, and the chief negotiator from the European Union was not very optimistic. And as you have maybe seen, the British Parliament are now facing a proposal from the government to bypass some of the old agreements in the withdrawal agreement, which would affect particularly the Northern Ireland border. And this is very unfortunate because that document is a legal document, and if that is violated, it's a breach of international law. And it certainly does not facilitate the negotiations. I still think there is a little bit of time. And of course, even if I'm sorry that the UK is leaving the European Union because they are great friends and partners, that has to be respected, of course. And I think we can find a way to cooperate in the future as well. But right now it's looking increasingly difficult. And there has to be an agreement by the end of October, because it has to be translated, confirmed in the different parliaments and so on. And we are already mid-September, so it's looking quite gloomy, I would say, but I'm sure you have questions on this. And then, of course, we have to see, shall we resume the ideas of this conference on the future of Europe, on see how can Europe get strong again after Corona in all these issues? How can Europe become a global actor? The President of the Commission, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, said in her inauguration speech that she wanted Europe to be a strong geopolitical actor. But right now we have a lot of geopolitical problems, and Europe is not really handling that. As I mentioned, we have the situation with Turkey, we have Russia, we have the situation in the Mediterranean, Greece and Turkey there. We have the poisoning of Mr. Navalny. We have a difficult relation with our transatlantic friends, with the US. US and Europe has always been friends since the end of the Second World War. We cooperated together to build the post-war order, to build the international order of multilateralism, international organizations. And even if we haven't always agreed on everything, that relationship, that friendship is very, very strong. Many Europeans have relatives who have fought together with American soldiers, and that emotional tie is very strong. But now we are facing a situation where the US president have said that EU is a foe, that EU is a threat to internal security, and thereby imposing tariffs on steel and aluminium. where we have a situation where the transatlantic relationship doesn't seem to be special or doesn't seem to be worth cultivating. And that is, of course, offending and very, very sad. The current administration have left not only the Paris Agreement, but also many other international organizations, UNESCO, WHO, even if it hasn't entered into force yet, the Iran Agreement, several others, and is also weakening its engagement in NATO, which of course puts a lot of anxiety in many European countries. And also said that trade wars are good and easy to win, and is using trade and tariff as a foreign policy tool in a way we haven't seen before in history, not only vis-a-vis the EU, but also vis-a-vis Mexico, Iran, China, etc. And this is something that we need to handle, because even if we disagree, we need to cooperate across the Atlantic. So we need to find a strategy where we can identify some sort of positive agenda. We have been proposing a smaller trade agreement. I was negotiating a big one, TTIP it was called. That failed, and that is now in the freezer. But we have tried to see, can we have a small trade agreement? And my successor managed to have a very limited one, but still it's a beginning to take away tariffs on some key products, lobsters, for instance, in the US, but also some other products in the EU. And that can create some sort of trust. And based on that, you can elaborate. We've also been discussing for many years some regulatory cooperation, how you can facilitate certificates, licenses, regulations, and standards that are basically the same across the Atlantic, but we just have to recognize them on each other's side. That would save a lot of money. It's very technical, but there's a huge amount of money in that, and that would be good also to build confidence. And I think we can cooperate on China, on cyber, and on other items as well. So right now, of course, the European Union is busy figuring out two alternative options. Either if Mr. Trump is re-elected, what do we do then? Or if there is a change in the White House, what do we do then? What is possible on both sides? Because either outcome is, of course, up to the American people, but the Europe has to face these and try to find ways to engage. And that has effects also on multilateral cooperation, international organizations, and the revival of these organizations, where we would very much like to have US engagement as well. China, of course, have come up quite strong after the pandemic and is recovering fast. And as the global scene has been quite empty, it has also used this situation to expand its leadership. We see quite aggressive investments in some critical infrastructure. We see that they are promoting an alternative global order. We see a deterioration of human rights. We saw what happened with the security law in Hong Kong. We see what's happening, that goes several years back, when it comes to the Uyghurs in those labor camps, where maybe 2 million people are being held. And we see an increased oppression of opposition journalists, intellectuals, and so on. So this is, of course, very, very, very worrying. China, when it joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, made a lot of promises, that's 18 years ago now, that they would change their economy going in a more market-oriented direction. And in the beginning, it looked as if they would, but now they haven't. They've come back quite considerably, which is a breach of promises, and which is also creating problems on the global trading scene, because they are dumping the markets, they have overproduction, they are subsidizing state-owned enterprises and industries in a way that Western Europe or the Western world cannot do, and that sort of makes the competition unfair. It also has special rules making it increasingly difficult to invest and trade in China. And from the EU side, the European countries have been quite divided vis-a-vis China. That is, of course, something that China has used very cleverly, and that must be addressed. I think we see a tendency that the EU is now waking up, seeing that it has to be tougher with China, engage with China, non-engagement is not an option. You have to engage, but you have to do it in a tougher way. We now have legislation on investment screening and tougher rules on that. And there is also talks about having a more realistic trade policy where you have to be welcome investments, but not at any price. This is a difficult process because some countries are very, very dependent on China and Chinese investments and trade. But I think we're getting there. And on Monday, there will be a virtual summit between the EU leaders and China. So we'll see what comes out of that. These are the most pressing items, of course, to deal with, and there's a lot of relations in the world as well. And there is this need to really reform international organizations. WTO is probably the most urgent one, and the need to make sure that trade, that rule-based trade can be one way out of the crisis, not only for Europe and the US, but also for the world. WTO will soon agree on a new director general, and hopefully he or she will be one who can lead those reforms. There also been a lot of violation of WTO rules during this crisis and just before by China, but also by the US. And we need to make sure that we can engage both these countries in their reform, and that will not be easy, but we need to see that we can have the benefits of trade, but also making sure that those benefits are spread more evenly, more fairly in society, so they also benefit people at large. So these are a few issues on the agenda. How can the EU not only recover internally, that has to be done by the economic recovery, by making sure that investments is future-proof and sustainable, that we overcome those divisions that were created by the crisis, that we address the issue of breach of values internally, and that we can come out stronger internally, do the necessary reforms, but also finding a way to become a stronger global actor in the world, especially now when as a defender of multilateral system and international cooperation, the EU is finding itself more and more isolated, actually. Needs to be sure that it can play a political role on the scene. And how to do that is by a more strategic, unanimous view on this. Probably also changing the rules of procedure and the treaties, even if that is not done over a weekend, making sure that you can do foreign policy without having to have unanimity on every little comma in that, because then it becomes a compromise, and sometimes a very weak compromise. So you have to move towards more majority decision in at least parts of the foreign policy, and to equip itself with better, more modern tools, and working with allies. There are lots of countries also around there in the world that I haven't mentioned, but who also feel that we need to be stronger together, we need to reform international organizations, we need to make those alliances, and we need to use this crisis to do something jointly. There are positive signs happening. There are discussions on a global agreement on medical equipment and medicines, but you would take away tariffs and from that, so that you could, in a future crisis, trade that in much cheaper and easier. And there are different initiatives taken to reform institutions, and that's good. And I can only hope that Europe will be strong to engage in this. And of course, we would, in an ideal scenario, also have a strong friend and partner in the US in doing this. I think, Kitty, I stopped there. I'm sure that there are questions. Probably I provoked a few at least, or comments, and I'm looking very much forward to do that. Thank you.